Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is my buddy Chris Scruggs. He's going to talk about the 50th anniversary of the Byrds' classic album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo.
Marty and Roger are pals, and Marty's connection, sort of to that world goes back to, he came to town to play in Lester Flatt's band when he was 13 years old and lived at Roland White's house. And Roland White had, his record collection was a lot of bluegrass. But then he had all these Byrds records, and Marty said, "What's the deal with all these Byrds records?" And he said, "Oh, my brother plays in the Byrds. He plays electric guitar. His name is Clarence." And so that was kind of the connection there. And of course, then Marty, 10 years or so after Clarence passed away, Marty bought Clarence's guitar from his widow, which is very significant because it's the first guitar with sort of like the modern B-bender on it, where, the guitar strap attaches to the strap pin, but the strap pin is connected to a lever. And then when you're playing the guitar, if you push the neck away from you, it bends that lever and it pulls that B string up to get the pedal steel sound. And that's the only electric guitar that Marty plays and has since he acquired it in, I think, like 1984 or 83 or somewhere along those lines. So him and Roger are buddies. And when Marty had his TV show, he had Roger on the show a few times. And Marty just loves it when that Clarence White Telecaster gets to sort of, weave through a song with Roger's 12-string Rickenbacker. Like, that's just such a sound. It's that later version of the Byrds kind of sound. It was about to be the 50th anniversary of the Sweetheart of the Rodeo record, which was the record that they made when Graham Parsons was in the band. And it was not the first country rock recordings, but it was the first thing to really make a statement and a big splash about that sound of, California rock and roll kids who dug Buck Owens and Merle Haggard wanting to make country music, but through their lens, So it was going to be the 50th anniversary of that, and Roger had the idea that there should be a little tour with just like a handful of shows in select cities with him and Chris Hilman, who were the only original Byrds when they made that record, and then with Marty and us as the sort of band for it. And I think the promoters and the tickets, that we ended up doing a lot more dates. I think we did close to 30 of those dates. At the end of the year, Roger said, and after this, we're not going to do it ever again because the 50th anniversary will be over. And there was places we didn't go to. Like, we didn't go to Denver. We didn't go to Seattle or Portland. We played some show in the South Bay, but we didn't do like a proper like San Francisco show or anything. There's a lot of things that we kind of passed over. And, maybe next year we should do some more. And McGuinn's thing was, nope, that was it, just the 1 year. Now, my argument is, well, the record came out very late in 68. So really, it's the 50th anniversary until like September of the next year, right? We're still in that 50th year. But I didn't, I'm just the bass player, so I wasn't in a position to suggest anything like that. But yeah, man, they're great guys. Roger taught me the trick about how to take a cork from a wine bottle and just drop it on a table, and then it stands up straight. On my birthday, we were on the road on my birthday. It was my, my 36th birthday, and him and his wife and Chris's wife took me out to dinner, and Roger was just doing that while we were waiting for the food to come, just dropping this cork, showed me how to drop it so it would then stand up straight on its own. I can't do it every time, but there's a little trick to it. So almost like a music box. It's got this perpetual motion to it. When Roger, rolls on that 12 string, it's got this, and with all the compression on it, it's got this otherworldly kind of sound. Well, back then, I don't think he's ever been really that much of like a gear centric person like a lot of people are today. I don't think a lot of the old timers were that heavy on gear. So when you meet one who is, it's kind of like, oh, wow, this guy like pays attention to like how the pickup is wound and the capacitor value and that. But most of those guys back then, I think there's a story where McCartney went to a music store and they said, "What kind of bass strings do you like?" And he said, "Long, shiny ones," or something like that, But that's the attitude of a lot of those folks back then. They was just like, I don't know, that's my guitar. It's what they had at the store, so I bought it. Of course, McGuinn wanted the 12-string Rickenbacker because that's what George Harrison had that he used on A Hard Day's Night, and that was sort of the thing that made him, because he was a 12-string acoustic player, was like, man, I could start a rock and roll band. So he got one of the very first kind of production 12-string Rickenbackers that had a different body shape than Harrison's. And eventually he added a third pickup to it. Originally it was the 2 pickup model, the 360 Rickenbacker. And he had a middle pickup put in, which is, from the factory, that's a 370. And I think part of the sound with him, Kenny's told me this because he's talked a lot to Roger about how he gets his sound, is it's mostly the bridge pickup, but he feeds in just a little bit of that middle pickup, which you can't do on a 360. You've got to have a 370 for that. You got to have the middle, the third pickup. And a lot of compression. In the studio back then, they would compress that guitar heavily. And I think sometimes they used an amplifier, and sometimes they would just DI it. They would just plug it straight into the board. And live, that's what McGuinn always does too. He had a small amp, like a little Roland Cube amp on stage, just as a monitor so we could hear it. But, the house was just a DI with a ton of compression on it. Like just squash it down to, and then that makes it sound like the Byrds, And it's a different sound than when George Harrison played his. George played his through a Vox amplifier. Roger's thing was, direct into the board with a ton of compression. I think some of those very early recordings, like I think maybe Turn, Turn, Turn was a like an Epiphone amplifier, like a Gibson-made Epiphone amp. I'm not sure, though. Don't quote me on that, but a lot of it was just DI'd, just plugged right in. A lot of times he uses this thing by a brand called Jangle Box, and people kind of talk about those, but our sound guy kind of preferred the compression that he had in the soundboard. So we went with that on that run.
Was he pleasant to be around?
Yeah, super pleasant, super great guy, Hilman too, we saw him a few months ago. We played in Ventura, and that's where he lives, Ventura, kind of in the Central Coast area. Yeah, he's just, both of those guys are just a joy to be around, we were doing a lot of unison parts because we had a lot of people on stage who could sing, and a lot of the sound of those Byrds records is double tracking things. So a lot of times we would end up, like with 5 people singing, but like, only 2 or 3 parts, and to give it that really lush kind of California kind of thing to it. Yeah, the first couple we did a rehearsal day at a hotel bar that we'd rented where we were staying the day before our first show in LA. And I was playing with my fingers. I wasn't, I was just feeling around with different things. And then I played some with the pick, and Hilman said, like, I like it when you play with the pick, and I was like, okay, because I know that he played with the pick. And that's the California 60s bass sound, is Fender bass with flat wound strings and a pick, So I made a point to play with a pick, just to get that kind of, 60s pick bass California Byrds. I just use what I always, I play bass with a pick pretty regularly. Hilman said he always used a light pick, like a 63 gauge or whatever. Like, some of the nylon picks, they have the gauge written on there, like a pretty floppy kind of pick, which would give you a little more of that puh kind of sound. But I like a thicker pick with bass. And Carol Kay always used a thick pick, and I think Joe Osborne did too. And they did most of the bass session work in California back then. And now I was playing bass on some of the stuff, but once we got to the Sweetheart stuff, I was playing steel, and Kenny was playing the bass. And Marty made a big point to have me play everything note for note as close as I could to Lloyd, even down to like fills. Like if there was certain fills, he'd just sit his chair just right across from me, just kind of like how I am with you right now. Say, all right, now let's play the song. And on that bit, can you do 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 do? And he played on the Clarence Telecaster, do 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 do. And I go, na 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 na. Yeah, that's it. And he kind of, he was like steel guitar, Lloyd Green, Sweetheart of the Rodeo boot camp. And it paid off because when we played at the Ryman, Lloyd was there. He was sitting with Eric Brace, I think about 7 rows back, right in front of me, watching me. So I was, as Maxine Brown would have said, I was nervous as a whore in church. But
how many bands would try that hard to make it right?
Probably not a lot. Probably not a lot. And that was all, Marty's, motivation and work ethic that made that what it was. I think it was a special thing, that whole tour. I wish we could have done a little bit more of them. Like I said, we could have gone through the next year up until September. It would have been 50th anniversary still. Another interesting thing about that record is at least I can't hear it, any 12-string Rickenbacker on that record. There's no prominent parts played with it. It's basically a steel record. It's basically Lloyd Green. There's 3 or 4 songs on that record that have J.D. Manis on steel that were cut in California. But for the most part, it's whether it be J.D. or Lloyd, which is the most of it, it's a steel guitar record as far as the prominent lead instrument goes, which is a real departure for that band because it had always been about the 12 string before that. And Clarence started doing sessions with them a couple records before that one. And there's a few songs that he played on the Sweetheart. 100 Years From Now, Lloyd told me the story about that. That was the one song, that was the last song they cut on the record. And they had already done all their work in Nashville. And so they needed to fly Lloyd out to LA to cut. And they had to do it on a Sunday because Lloyd was booked so far in advance. That was the one day of the week that he could. So he flew all the way out to LA, did that one song, and then flew all the way home. And that was the one time that he worked with Clarence. And there's debate over whether or not Clarence's guitar had the pedal on it at that time, the pull string bender, and over which guitar it was. And I asked Lloyd, I said, so which guitar was he playing? Was it the white one that Bob Warford owns, or was it the Sunburst one that Marty has? He said, it was the one that Marty has. And I said, was the pedal on it already? He said, yeah, he showed me how it works. And Lloyd, his memory is impeccable. So if Lloyd said it, that's good enough for me.